Hi, Internet. It's Emily SW.
Sam.
And we are coming at you with another episode of the Podcastle Poetry Month edition. April is National Poetry Month.
That's what you
snaps,
do. Snaps.
Snaps.
You read a poem, right?
You snaps. Or if you're Elwoods. Yeah, so we're doing some poetry specials for our April episodes, and today we are focusing on someone who is very well known, not necessarily for his poetry, J.R.R. Tolkien.
After last time, we need a bit of whimsy.
We do. We need to break it up a little bit.
The Geek Love episode was heavy.
Yeah, it got heavy, it was a little dark, yeah. So we're brightening the mood for spring.
Yeah, so we're crossing over now into fantasy.
Yes, we're crossing over into a very well-known fantasy writer, but he was also a bit of a prolific poet. As per usual, we'll give a little backstory, and then we'll get into the poems. I've selected... Now, he has a lot of poetry. There's a lot of poetry actually in The Lord of the Rings, in The Hobbit, in The Silmarillion. He's got a lot of stuff in universe. But he did also write a lot of poetry outside of that, but that's hard to track down. But so today we're going to focus on some of the more well-known verses that came out of Lord of the Rings, because I think that's what most people have a reference for.
Have you ever read The Lord of the Rings?
No. Now, here's the thing. I'm going to justify this, because as a fantasy nerd, I feel that I'm lacking in this. And it is on my to-read list. I read The Hobbit. I love The Hobbit. And then I read The Hobbit when I was younger, like 12, 13. And I was like, I'm going to read Lord of the Rings. And I think the movies... Whenever I read The Hobbit, it was after the movies had come out, and I was obsessed with the movies because I was a fantasy nerd, and there weren't a lot of fantasy movies. It was basically Willow. I don't know if you've seen that movie. It's like a cheesy fantasy movie that Disney put out. I like it. I think in retrospect it's not as good as I thought it was as a kid. But anyways, I love the movie Willow and Lord of the Rings. I've never been able to get through the Fellowship of the Ring. I don't think I've ever made it out of the Shire. I've tried, like, every couple of years. I'll either pick the book up or I'll try an audio version, and either I get really busy or I just get bored because I have ADHD. But I'm gonna finish it eventually, and I'm gonna read the entire trilogy one of these days. What about you?
So my relationship with a Lord of the Rings book is almost exactly everything you just said. I read The Hobbit because the movies were coming out, and my dad is a big fan.
Oh, okay.
Of
that
Tolkien.
made...
So he had all the paperbacks from the 70s,
Mm-hmm.
and he also had, like, the complete guide to Middle-earth,
Ooh.
and he had the unfinished tales, and everything. So he encouraged this, and he's, you should definitely read this. It's great, you should definitely read this. And I read The Hobbit, and I think I also started The Fellowship, and I think I got as far as, like, Tom Bombadil.
Yeah.
And then I gave up, but I haven't picked it up again since.
Oh, no, I've definitely tried a couple times. The thing about it is, and this is a common experience, because The Hobbit, he actually, I'm not going to get into it too much, but as I was researching Tolkien and his backstory, The Hobbit, he actually kind of wrote for his kids. So The Hobbit was sort of intended to be for a younger audience, so it's more digestible, and it's not as dense. Whereas then Fellowship of the Ring is just an adult fantasy novel, and there's just so much to wade through at the beginning, and it's a little bit of a slog.
Especially because you read The Hobbit, and then you go right into The Lord of the Rings.
They're very different.
And yeah, the writing is different.
Yeah. They're very different, and, again, he wrote for different audiences. Again, he kind of wrote that. He didn't really write it to go straight into publishing. He wrote it, and his kids really enjoyed it because he'd already been writing in that universe. The Hobbit wasn't the first thing he wrote in that universe. And then he ended up publishing it, and it was really successful, which is then how Lord of the Rings came about. But anyways, yeah, no, I will do it eventually. I have a friend who's very, 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 very into Lord of the Rings. So I'm very familiar with the world of Lord of the Rings because I've seen the movies a bunch of times.
You know what I got my dad a couple years ago? I got him the Tolkien translation of Beowulf.
Yes! I was reading about that too because he was very well known for that. Like, his translation of Beowulf is supposed to be very good. He was teaching it at a college, and he was very well respected for that work that he did. Well, that's a good transition. Let's segue into talking about the man himself.
I do know some of Tolkien's backstory because Mandy was very into Tolkien. And she did a presentation in 7th grade, I think it was. We were supposed to read a biography about someone. This is for an English class. So we were supposed to read a biography about someone and then do a presentation. She read hers about Tolkien, and you were supposed to have like prizes, and then at the end you'd ask the class 3 questions, and whoever got the questions right, it was supposed to prove to the teacher, I guess, that people were paying attention while their classmates were giving the presentations. Well, I won one of Mandy's prizes, and it was a pack of the Lord of the Rings trading cards. Which is probably in that Yu-Gi-Oh box over there.
That's really funny.
So I do know a little bit.
Okay, well, we'll get into it, audience. Let us know if there's anything here you already knew, or if I can enlighten you. Starting off right from the top, J.R.R. Tolkien, his full name is John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. Was that? Reuel? R-E-U-E-L? Reuel? So that's what the R.R. stands for. J.R.R. stands for. And he was born January 3rd, 1892, and he passed away September 2nd, 1973.
Ah, a Capricorn.
Yes. A fellow Capricorn. Now, he was a commander of the Order of the British Empire, which was bestowed on him by Queen Elizabeth II in January 1972 for service to English literature. C.S. Lewis also had that honor bestowed on him. And the separate fact to that, in December of 1951, Tolkien had been on the list to get the honor, but he had declined in 1951. But then he accepted again when it came about in 1972. Which I thought was really interesting. Okay, so just very condensed little history here. These are kind of the important bits and also the bits that I thought were interesting. So he was born in South Africa, but then at the age of 3, him, his mom, and his little brother went back to England for a visit. But then his dad died back in South Africa, so there was no reason to go back to South Africa, so they didn't. They stayed in England. And then eventually his mom got diabetes and died in 1904 after she had converted to Catholicism, which was not super cool to her family, who was Anglican. They really did not approve of this, but she converted shortly before she died. I think it was like in 1900, so she died in 1904. There was a Roman Catholic priest that had been taking care of her when she got sick. She got sick and then she was in a diabetic coma for a little bit before she passed. Because she didn't remarry, she left the kids in the care of this father in the church. And then Tolkien, he went to school, all this stuff. I didn't put a lot of details about that. But the thing I did find interesting, so Tolkien met and fell in love with a woman named Edith Mary Bratt, who was 3 years older than him. Refreshing. Sometimes we read about these people who are really into really young girls.
Yeah,
or their cousins.
We've had a couple of those.
Yeah. Looking at you, Poe. He falls in love with her at the age of 16. They lived, it might have been like the same lodgings or like the same street, something like that. And then this priest guy was like, no, you can't do that. You gotta do your studies. It's gonna distract you. You can't, I forbid it. So then he ends up going to college, goes away to university, but then they meet again by chance when he's, I think, 19. And he's like, oh my god, I love this girl. I met her again. And the priest is like, no, you gotta wait till you're 21. So then he turns 21, immediately writes Edith a letter, and then they're engaged the same week. I just thought it was a cute little story. Very romantic. Oh, I didn't write down the year. I believe it was 1914. And then they got married in 1916, which was right before Tolkien went off to fight in France in World War I. He served as a second lieutenant in the 11th Battalion of the Lancashire Fusiliers. So 3 months after he was married, he was sent to France. He served as a communications officer during the Battle of the Somme. Eventually, he came down with trench fever, and he was sick for a while, and eventually got moved back to England, where he did a home service at various camps and was promoted to a lieutenant during the course of the war.
And that's all relevant because his experience during the war did influence his stories.
Yes, and that's why I included it. Well, first of all, I figured you would like the little tidbit about World War I.
Yes.
But yeah, a lot of his friends died during the war. So this was after he'd been to university and he graduated with an English degree. And some of his friends had created a little sort of group where they, in the library of the university, they illegally brewed tea and like sat around and discussed literature and stuff. So they had this little like club, and then when they got found out and kicked out of, they weren't allowed to brew tea in the library. So they had to go find somewhere else to do it.
That's what we need to do.
Mm-hmm.
Not in the library.
No.
But just secret tea meetings.
Yeah, secret tea meetings, yeah. So a couple of his friends that he did that with at university passed away during the war, and that had a big effect on him, as you can imagine. He also first began working in the Lord of the Rings universe during the war. So he wasn't working on like The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings or anything like that, but he started writing something called the Book of Lost Lost Tales, which was published posthumously by his son. But that was when he first started writing about the elves and the kind of the history of Middle-earth. Later, he revisited some of those stories in the Silmarillion, which was published later. After the war, he worked at a couple different colleges. First, though, he worked at the Oxford English Dictionary, which I thought was fascinating.
That is fascinating.
And then he worked at the University of Leeds and also the University of Oxford. He was a professor of various things. So he was the professor of the English language. He also taught Anglo-Saxon language and English literature. So he was a philologist, which philology, which is a great word, by the way, is the study of language, especially in a philosophical manner and as a science. And the languages that he was well-versed in, and now I might have missed some because the man has a lot of languages under his belt. French, German, Latin, Greek, Old English, Middle English, Gothic, and Old Norse.
Where did he shove all those in his brain?
I don't know. I guess I was reading he had a talent for language, so that's how he picked up French, German, Latin, and Greek. Kind of the common...
Yes, that sounds like a pretty common set of languages for a learned person.
Yeah, and then when he went to like a higher level of university is when he got the opportunity to delve into kind of Old English, Middle English, like those other languages, from my understanding.
Obviously, English evolves out of Old English and Middle English, but like Gothic is a dead language.
Yes. We know him as a modern audience. We know him obviously as the father of fantasy, essentially, as the writer of Lord of the Rings. But he was very famous during his time he did a very famous, well-known, well-respected well-known are synonyms. Well-respected Beowulf translation. He did other translations as well. He wrote kind of scholarly papers on the subject. He wrote a very famous one, which I have a book called Poems and Stories, which is a collection of some of Tolkien's works, which includes On Fairy Stories, which is an essay that he wrote about fantasy and fairy tales, which was also very well regarded. So I'm going to read that just for my own personal enjoyment because I'm a nerd. So he's very well respected in the scholarly kind of academic community, as well as being a very popular novelist. People loved The Hobbit. They loved Lord of the Rings. It was very popular. The other thing I want to note here is while he ended up at Pembroke College in Oxford, which is where he met C.S. Lewis, as well as started writing The Hobbit. Now, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis's friendship is one of my favorite things in the world. It's purely because it's just so funny to me because C.S. Lewis is very famous for writing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Yes.
Which is also very famously a Christian... Allegory. Very obvious Christian allegory. He and Tolkien kind of butted heads a little bit. I was reading because Tolkien was, raised Catholic and C.S. Lewis was Protestant. Tolkien kind of disapproved of him not becoming Catholic, which I just thought was funny. But anyway, not to drag on about Tolkien. He wrote, in addition to Lord of the Rings, he did write a lot of verse, and he...
Did you make a note about the languages he made up?
Oh no, I forgot. I didn't. So you can see here, because he was so well versed in so many different languages, you can see how he could invent one.
Or two,
yeah.
The languages that he uses in Lord of the Rings, and maybe you read this in your research, and you can tell me if this is correct or not, but he actually started writing his Middle-earth lore to go with a language that he had invented. Like, he invented Elvish, or one of those languages first, and then he created a story to put it in.
Oh, see, I didn't specifically read that, but I was just trying to put together kind of a bare bones. Like, I didn't delve too much into the actual, Lord of the Rings stuff, because I was trying to focus on the poetry.
One of the things that has been going around the internet a little bit that I've seen recently is about how in, I guess, the appendix, or the guide to the Lord of the Rings, is that he presents the Lord of the Rings as a translation of something from the Hobbit language.
Yeah.
So everyone, their real names are actually all different, which is pointless because they already have fantasy names.
Yes.
Right? Like, why did he make fantasy versions of the already fantasy names? Why did he do that?
Yeah, I don't know.
How many people named Frodo do you know?
One. He doesn't exist.
See?
Yeah.
He didn't need to do that. He could have just made those... Oh, whatever.
But yeah, before we delve into the poetry, we're actually gonna discuss here, I just wanted to mention one thing that I came across in my research that I just found really fascinating. Him and a colleague came out with this book of poetry. A number of verses are written in multiple languages, so Modern English, Middle English, Old English, Icelandic, Latin, and Gothic. And so he came out, it's called Songs for the Philologists. Some of them are written by E.V. Gordon, and some of them are by J.R.R. Tolkien, and some of them are folk songs that already existed in different traditions. Very difficult to find, so we're not going to be discussing the actual contents here. But I just thought, this is such a fascinating project to discuss because I think it really illustrates his relationship with language and poetry. There's original works that they wrote in these different languages, and some of them are sent to common tunes. Before we also get into the poetry, a bunch of Tolkien's letters are available to read, and this quote I think really stood out to me, and is part of the reason why I included the details about his war service. I said, outside Lichfield Cathedral, to a friend of my youth, long since dead of gas gangrene, God rest his soul, I grieve still. Why is that cloud so beautiful? He said, because you have begun to write poetry, John Ronald. He was wrong. It was because death was near, and all was intolerably fair, lost ere grasped. That was why I began to write poetry. So this is a footnote from a letter to Michael Tolkien, who was the son, one of Tolkien's sons.
You prepared some poems.
Yes. So I have a collection of poems. I grabbed a couple that are kind of more well-known out of Lord of the Rings. But I guarantee you'll be familiar with some of these verses.
Here's my question about the poems in the novel.
Mm-hmm.
Are they in the novel songs?
Some of them are.
Because you know what it reminds me of? It's probably what inspired the Redwall series.
It
has a lot of songs that are written into the text as part of the story.
Yes. I bet Brian Jocks took inspiration from Tolkien. So a lot of this research, a lot of Tolkien's background information I got from, his estate has an official website that has his, official biography. So I read that. There's also the TolkienGateway.net, which is a fan wiki, which is where I got a lot of these, which I found very helpful because when I was reading about the poems, they had little, background information on each of the poems, where they appeared and the books and all that. In the book, some of them are sung. I think all the ones I grabbed are actually by Bilbo Baggins. So, and some of them are described as being sung, and some of them are kind of walking songs. Yeah, these are all written by Bilbo. All my selections from various points in his life. So the first one, we'll go kind of chronologically, so to speak. So we're going to start with The Road Goes Ever On, which was in The Hobbit originally and is kind of reprised at various points. So it first appears in The Hobbit, but then later appears in The Lord of the Rings by both Bilbo and then Frodo kind of revises it as well. In The Hobbit, at the end, Bilbo's coming back to the Shire after his big adventure. And this is where we first see this poem. Roads go ever, ever on, over rock and under tree, by caves where never sun has shone, by streams that never find the sea, over snow by winter sown, and through the merry flowers of June, over grass and over stone, and under mountains in the moon. Roads go ever, ever on, under cloud and under star, yet feet that wandering have gone, turn at last to home afar. Eyes that fire and sword have seen, and horror in the halls of stone, look at last on meadows green, and trees and hills they long have known. That's the first we see of this little walking song. Bilbo is singing it at the end of The Hobbit when he's returning. And then it appears again a couple times during the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So the first time it comes back up is, again, Bilbo is singing this when he's leaving the Shire near the beginning and he's going to Rivendell. And so this reprise, the road goes ever on and on, down from the door where it began. Now far ahead the road has gone, and I must follow if I can, pursuing it with eager feet until it joins some larger way, where many paths and errands meet. And whither then, I cannot say.
It's kind of just a summary of what's happening in the story at that point.
Well, and the way it's described, again, like a walking song. I went through a lot of different poems trying to narrow it down for what we would discuss here. It seemed like a very hobbity thing to do. Of, you're going for a walk, make a song.
Sing a little tune while you go about.
Which I think also has historical roots, and you get marching songs. I think that's kind of a common thing. There's lots of travel songs, things to pass the time.
It's very charming.
Yes. The second time in The Lord of the Rings is very similar to this one that I just read. Bilbo says, but this time Frodo is saying it to his friends. on their way to Crick Hollow. And then the third version in The Lord of the Rings is again spoken by Bilbo. So they're in Rivendell, and the hobbits have returned from their journey, so it's at the very end of Lord of the Rings. And Bilbo's not really old, and he's sleepy, so he's murmuring the verse, whispering it, and then he falls asleep. The road goes ever on and on, out from the door where it began. No far ahead the road has gone. Let others follow it who can. Let them a journey new begin, but I at last, with weary feet, will turn towards the lighted inn, my evening rest and sleep to meet. The different versions of that same poem that carries through multiple books in the universe. And I just think the fact that there's so much poetry in this universe gives it a lot of life. Because song is such an innate sort of quote-unquote human art. Like, all cultures have some form of music, right? Humans just kind of create art. And so the fact that all the different, you've got elves, the hobbits, there's man, whoever, they all have their own different songs and traditions and stuff, and they're all kind of woven into the books. I haven't read them yet, but it gives it a lot of life.
You get a real sense of what Bilbo is thinking and feeling in that moment.
Again, it's great for the world building too, because each different sort of, like, the hobbits and the elves have very different forms of song and poetry. The way they write is very different, so it helps flesh out the differences in their cultures and their values, even. Because a hobbit's values and an elf's values are two very different things. Okay. So the next one we're going to talk about. So this is a poem that Bilbo writes in honor of his friend, Duanadin, who is Aragorn. This poem is written by Bilbo, but Gandalf leaves it in a letter that he leaves for Frodo and the Prancing Pony, which is when, he has to go his own way, and he leaves them this letter here, and he tells Frodo and the other hobbits, like, you gotta go to the Prancing Pony, don't talk to anybody, whatever, you gotta get there, I'll meet you there. But then he's not there. It's the letter. And in the movie, I don't think they don't talk about the poem at all. But it's important in the book, in the story, because the poem is left in there so that Frodo can help identify this person he's supposed to meet. The man with many names. If you've only seen the movies, Aragorn is probably what you most know him as. He's also known as Strider, which is how he introduces himself in the movie too at first, before we learn his name is Aragorn. But, so Gandalf puts the poem in there so that Frodo can identify the real Strider that he's supposed to meet. And then in the story, Aragorn ends up quoting the first couple lines of the poem without, knowing that Frodo has read it, does help confirm his identity to Frodo. And Bilbo ends up reciting the poem at the Council of Elrond when Boromir expresses doubts about Aragorn's claim to be the heir of Isildur. So that's where this appears. That's the context. All that is, and now this one, you'll know. You'll know this one, at least a couple lines. All that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. From the ashes a fire shall be woken. A light from the shadows shall spring. Renewed shall be the blade that was broken. The crownless again shall be king. So that line, not all those who wander are lost, is one of the most quoted lines from the entire...
In the entirety of the English language?
Yes.
And this is what it's from?
This is what it's from.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, so the first line, all that is gold does not glitter, is a play on the common expression, which is all that glitters is not gold. And so that originates... I also wrote this down. Doing a little bit of philology here, the study of language, the history of language. May date back to Aesop, as in Aesop's Fables. So around the 12th century. It appeared, Chaucer gave two early versions in English, and some of us Shakespeare is in here too, because everything comes back to Shakespeare.
You gotta put Shakespeare in there somehow.
Now, the popular form of the expression is derivative of a line from The Merchant of Venice, which says all that glisters is not gold.
And we don't really use the word glister anymore.
No, that's a very Shakespearean, old-timey word for instead of glitters.
Glister.
But yeah, so not all those who wander are lost. That's where that comes from.
That's where that comes from.
A poem written by Bilbo Baggins in honor of his friend Aragorn.
And the bit about the broken blade, crownless again, was used in the film, wasn't it?
Yes. I just watched these fairly recently, so it's fresh in my mind. That, I think, is probably the most famous, at least, section, of the poetry. Because, how many pieces of merch have you seen? Not all those who wander are lost on, millennial tattoos. So many t-shirts.
It was referenced in a series of unfortunate events.
Mm-hmm.
Though, I don't think, as a child, you can really fully appreciate that series. because the entire thing is just reference after reference after reference to classic literature.
Yeah.
That as a kid you likely are not aware of.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, something for the parents who are reading it to the kids, I guess. But okay, so last up on our Bilbo Baggins poetry tour, a la JR, this is something that Bilbo sings to Frodo. So this is from the Fellowship of the Ring. In Rivendell, he gives Frodo his sword and his armor, so Sting and the mithril. He sings this song to Frodo before they go on the quest. And now, this is interesting because there's a couple different musical adaptations for it. You can actually go on YouTube and listen to various versions of this. Donald Swan recorded some songs related to a bunch of J.R.R. Tolkien's works, so he did a version of this. Summoning used the poem for lyrics, which Summoning is an Austrian black metal band.
Black metal people love Tolkien.
Yeah. And Burzum also was inspired by this poem to write the lyrics of the song, Beholding the Daughters of the Firmament.
Burzum itself is a word, the Mordor language. It means darkness, and it's from that line that's on the ring.
Mm-hmm.
That's where Burzum comes from. It's almost just like a trope.
Yeah. I mean, it tracks for black metal.
Yeah.
So here's the poem that sparked so much. I sit beside the fire and think of all that I have seen, of meadow flowers and butterflies in summers that have been, of yellow leaves and gossamer, and autumns that there were, with morning mist and silver sun and wind upon my hair. I sit beside the fire and think of how the world will be when winter comes without a spring that I shall ever see. For still there are so many things that I have never seen. In every wood, in every spring, there is a different green. I sit beside the fire and think of people long ago, and people who will see a world that I shall never know. But all the while I sit and think of times there were before. I listen for returning feet and voices at the door. So it's kind of a bittersweet. So this Bilbo sings it to Frodo before he goes off.
At this point, Bilbo doesn't know really if Frodo's going to come back or not. Because they're going on an extremely perilous quest.
Yeah.
And
yes.
he has no idea how this is going to end.
No, and at the same time, Bilbo is also not getting any younger. And he's, since he's given up the ring, he's aging somewhat pretty rapidly.
Yeah, because it's all catching up with him.
It's all catching up with him, yeah. Mm-hmm. So he's staying behind when he used to be the one adventuring. Frodo is now off on this perilous quest, which is even, I don't know if more perilous than the quest Bilbo went on is the correct, but it's more, the stakes are higher.
Yes, a lot more hangs in the balance.
Yes.
As in the fate of the entire world. I was gonna say, too, Bilbo is also, so he's not the one adventuring anymore. He's passing off some of his prized possessions to Frodo as well. So he really is passing the torch of the adventurer off to Frodo.
He is, and hoping he comes back. Those were the Bilbo Baggins, the best of the hits that I pulled out.
Well, if they were all songs, that makes sense. And now that we've gone through this, because, sometimes I just need time to ruminate on things. Adding music, lyrics as poetry into a story does definitely elevate your world building. And I think that's something that a lot of novels are missing. Characters don't do anything aside from what's required for the plot.
Yeah.
And it's almost like they're not people, they're just vehicles for the plot.
Yeah. Whereas
this makes the characters living people.
The world feels more tangible because it's so much more relatable. Like, how often, well, I don't know about you, I do a lot of humming, just like making little tunes to myself. I don't normally write, an entire metered rhyming verses.
Oh, no, because usually it's just something silly.
Yeah, or like I sing to my cat. Or there's specific little tunes that my father always kind of hummed to himself. So now I hum them to myself. And it's like not even little, I don't even know if it's based in a song or what. It's just like tiny little notes that now I have that I hum to myself when I'm doing mundane things. Yeah, and I do think it's an underutilized world building technique. But also it's a lot of work to actually create good poetry in a good work of fiction.
Also have to have an audience willing to read it.
Yeah.
I know for myself in Redwall, if there was suddenly a song that was more than a couple stanzas long, I probably just skipped over it. Here we can see they're related to the characters mindset.
Mm-hmm.
But as, a preteen, you're not really thinking that deeply about what you're reading.
No.
But those ones weren't really that long at all.
No, yeah, I didn't... none of the... I don't think any of the ones from Lord of the Rings are super long. I don't want to say that for sure. But the ones that I was looking at weren't super long.
Yeah, and I think it's a difference as well as having something that enhances the story versus something that's being so lengthy it takes you out of the story. Because now you've got a work within a work. So you don't want to completely disconnect what's going on.
Yeah, you don't want the reader to lose their immersion.
Right.
Especially in a fantasy story.
It's a good balance, I think, to have that.
Yeah.
Have characters that feel like real people that can exist almost off the page.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like when you're not reading them, they feel like they could be doing things.
Yeah, and they're multi-dimensional, and it's not just...
Yeah. But yeah, because he had a lot of poetry, so... I got a book, again, Poems and Stories is a kind of collection of some of Tolkien's other works outside of Lord of the Rings. The Adventures of Tom Bombadil is a pretty lengthy collection of various poems. There's different forms. So the different stories of Tom Bombadil, there's different meters, different subjects, different rhyming schemes. And so I do genuinely think Tolkien just loved poetry, and as I was reading about this, he took a lot of inspiration from the poetry and the forms of other languages. So like different kind of meter and stuff, different line lengths and rhythms and cadences, use those to write. He was writing in modern English, but he took some of his knowledge from translating things like Beowulf and other works like that. And I think some of the poetry when you read it is very, like what we read today was kind of normal to us as a modern English-speaking audience, I would say. It wasn't too difficult to understand, it wasn't too complicated or anything. But when you delve into Tom Bombadil, some of those meters and the rhyming schemes and stuff are a little funny. And it adds to it. Like, it takes a little more work to read, though, because it's kind of odd. But yeah, so maybe someday we'll be sitting here discussing Lord of the Rings.
We'll actually read them?
Yeah, well, that would be so many parts. We would have to break.
Maybe we'll just read it for just a normal review on one of our other platforms.
Add that to the list of...
The list that's just ever-growing.
Goes on and on, my friends. Okay, so that's it for this episode. Join us. Next week we'll have another...
Not next week.
No, in 2 weeks.
In 2 weeks. So we are an every other week production because that's about all of the editing time that I can handle.
Yeah, so join us in a fortnight. We'll be doing another Poetry Month special for April, National Poetry Month.
The format's going to be different next time.
Yeah.
I'm excited.
Yeah, we kind of split this up a little bit. So I masterminded the Tolkien episode. Sam masterminded the next episode. So you get to see a little peek into our brains and our thinking processes.
Yeah.
So join us next week.
Next time.
Next time. But yeah, leave us a comment down below. Let us know if you've read Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, or if you just want to berate us for having not.
Yeah, for really butchering Tolkien's genius. And if you have read Lord of the Rings, have you read Tolkien's poems? And if you haven't, I do recommend it. I've been really enjoying it. Fell down a bit of a rabbit hole. It's a lot of fun. So, highly recommend. Oh, and if you have read Lord of the Rings, what's your format recommendation, I should say? Because I've heard there are multiple different, like, audiobooks, there's different, like, full cast productions, or do you recommend just reading the book? Just flat out just reading it. So let us know what you think, and we'll talk to you next time. Goodbye!
Bye!